Hello, folks. Daniel with Driving and Dragons here with another D&D Reacts video. This time we will be going over to BECMI Berserker and taking a peek at Common People, modern world building casualty. Now, first off, we got to have a little bit of a confession. This is a bit of a tainted reaction. I filmed it and StreamYard glitched out sometime while I was recording, about 2-3 minutes in. So that entire recording got corrupted and I have to shoot it over. So unfortunately, it's not a pure reaction. But I watched a couple, about an hour or two of football and let it clear out of my head so I can come back to it and be at least a little bit more fresh again. I do have some things I disagree with him on, some places where I think he has a non sequitur or two. But overall, I pretty much agree with it. As everybody here knows, I have a Worldbuilding University playlist that has a ton of videos about building more realistic, more lived in, and more realistic's the best word for it, but more lived in immersive worlds in my World Builder University, which I'll link here. And world building to me is probably the most important facet of a game master. Sure, you can play the adventuring style where you just roll everything up on random tables, roll it up on your hex crawl and stuff to try and essentially farm out the creativity to tables and charts. But if you want a world that is immersive, that your players are going to take stock in, that they're going to have an emotional investment in, that they're going to have not even just an emotional investment, but an intellectual investment in, the only way you're going to get that is to have a world that feels like it's living and breathing, like it's acting outside of their interactions and interest, but also has the kind of commonalities and predictability out there that they feel like they can affect it. When you have a world that doesn't behave realistically, they have no way of predicting how their actions are going to affect the world around them. And as a result, it just makes it to where it's like, well, it doesn't matter what we do. The DM will do whatever they want to. So, yeah, small little things like, say, the common people are a big part of that. And we're going to get into it here in a second. While you're here, hype the video, drop down, leave a comment. In particular, leave comments to videos, either old or new, that you think I should do a reaction to, just to get some thoughts on. And share the video. Really, I mean that. Share the video in your social groups, your Facebook pages, on X, that sort of thing. Likes and shares and all that, and likes and hypes and comments, the stuff that feeds the algorithm is great. But to use some sales terms, the algorithm is cold calling and just kind of throws it out there in front of people and hopes they click on it. Whereas it's a warm handoff when you share the video, because when you share the video in your group or you share the video with your friends, they trust you to a certain extent. They've spoken to you before and they say, hey, if somebody is sharing this video, it must be worth watching. So it does a tremendous amount for the channel. And if you want to go a little bit further and you want to help not only the channel, but also some lucky content creator in the future, sign up on Patreon or sign up for a YouTube membership. And, then you can also be somebody who gets a chance to, nominate people to win the car that we're putting together here. And of course, the super stickers, which is the same thing as a super chat, just for a video as opposed to live stream. All that revenue goes back into developing, designing, and restoring the cars that we're going to give away. So, if you want to give back to the TTRPG community, that's a way to do it. It gets filtered through my YouTube and goes straight into stuff that we're going to turn around and give away, and hopefully make not only some giveaways and some blessings for some folks that we care about, but may also turn into some experiences in the future. Moving on from that, last but not least, absolutely not least if you ask me, is my Corvid Codex, the pulp anthology that I will be launching here soon. We've got 6 authors and 2 artists who are involved in that project. I'm going to be doing either the pre-orders or the Kickstarter for it here soon. I haven't decided which route I'm going with that, but we're going to go ahead and get it started. It will be something that is available not just in a PDF format, but we will be doing a true blue traditional paperback publishing run. And if everything plays out the way I'd like it to, maybe even a limited edition hardback, not a print on demand, not, the cheap pamphlet style that you get from a lot of the print on demand stuff, like, some of your drive through RPG adventures and stuff, but the kind of thing you can put on your bookshelf that you can be proud of and that you can look at and enjoy, just like you would getting something from Valentine Books or any of your other traditional publishing houses. So please be on the lookout for that. The link to my X profile will be in the pinned comment below. I'm actually posting a lot of the original artwork with some polls attached, just gauging whether or not you think that these images that these artists have put together prompt you to want to read the story. So now that that's over, let's go ahead and get into Common People, a modern world building casualty with the BECMI Berserker. And this is about a 17-minute video, so I figure our reaction is probably going to be somewhere in the 30-minute range, maybe a little bit tighter since I've already seen it and some of my thoughts are put together a little better. But let's get cracking.
Hi, I'm BECMI Berserker and welcome back to my channel. I've been mulling over the content of this video for quite some time. It's about a subject that's bothered me ever since 3rd edition. Well, not exactly, perhaps 5 or 6 years into 3rd edition, when the possibilities around builds and monster templates really began to crystallize within contemporary Dungeons & Dragons publications, normalizing the ecosystem they existed within to something that was beyond extraordinary, into, well, I was going to say fantasy, but we're playing a fantasy role-playing game, right? So what's my issue? Well, in my opinion, there has been a world-building casualty in all of this, a figure who is fundamental to not just storytelling, but how the world works, a figure that's been pivotal to how player characters interact with the world, anchoring them to their beginnings, their present, and their future. This figure is none other than the common man, or woman, or just plain commoner. Okay, so what do I mean? What's the point I'm trying to make? Well, to make that clear, we need to contextualize the place of the commoner in not only world building and campaign design, but their place in the world. I mean, what is the point of the common man or woman? From the earliest days of Dungeons and Dragons, the world was built on monsters and wicked sorcerers, just like it is today. But it was still strongly anchored to the quiet, unspoken labor of the commoner. The farmer tilling the field, the blacksmith hammering out horseshoes, or the miller grinding grain. This was not just an implied backdrop, it was explicitly demonstrated through storytelling. The common people were the infrastructure that made adventuring possible, through an inexhaustible availability of plot lines. But in recent years, the commoner appears to have become more peripheral than ever. Today, the mainstream game ecosystem has every creature defined by its special abilities, and every player character is a walking exception to the rule, which has actually ended up making them unexceptional.
Okay, so I'd like to point out something here. Well, that's an interesting pause spot there. You can kind of see the good old art filtering over that god-awful, terrible new art. I mean, that, I'm assuming Tiefling has a helmet that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The design on that's just god-awful. But anyway, that's definitely not the point here. It's not just that the common man has become peripheral. It is that the common man, there's not really such thing as a common man anymore. I very much disagree with and it may be where he started to notice it, but the big non sequitur that I pull from this, and I do acknowledge that I have a little bit of bias here, is that he puts a lot of it into the fact that 3.5 gave us a way to granularize our worlds. We could make things more granular. We could zoom in for more detail. And the simple fact of the matter is all it did was give us tools to have more detail in the areas we wanted to focus on and less in the areas we didn't. It was very modular, very adjustable. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be abused, misused, or taken off the rails in any level. I mean, from player characters to monster characters to magic items to cursed items, all the way down to the common person. Because of the mechanical depth of 3.5, it is pretty easy for you to take something and abuse it by just taking one mechanical dial and cranking it up to 11 while you have everything else at 2. But that said, that's not really the source of the issue. And when he starts talking about this, where he feels that source is, we're going to get into it. But the real truth of the matter is, you know, as you say, if everybody's special, then nobody is special. You become special by being unspecial. And that is kind of what's happened in a lot of, not just modern D&D, but modern fantasy in general, is it's all about the entirety of the world being a fantasy. You've even seen this a lot in fantasy literature, where a lot of your stories, you know, kind of the anime isekai thing is, it's the common man put into a completely fantastical world where nothing is normal. And he becomes the focal point and the person of interest through being the not normal person in the fantasy world. You have to have a certain amount of normality to ground your world and make it realistic. When I say realistic in this case, make it logically consistent. Because if you don't have logical consistency, you have no reason for players there's no underlying motivation for them to behave in a logically consistent manner. You get murder hobos because things are not logically consistent. You get loot goblins because things are not logically consistent. Little illogical behaviors and illogical setups in the world are what lead to these kind of bad behaviors, in part. Let's see what else he has to say.
So what's happened to the vanilla common man or woman in all of this? You know, the baseline commoner with no special abilities at all, apart from what their maker has enabled their 2 hands to create. Well, if you were to think of this from a Darwinian angle, I'd suggest they're becoming an endangered species. So I wanted to explore how the commoner has lost its place in D&D, why it matters, and what it reveals about the game's shifting priorities. Please be assured, this is not a nostalgic lament, but a strategic critique. What happens to a fantasy world, maybe even a fantasy role-playing game, when its foundation, the people who live and work in it, is forgotten? In early versions of Dungeons & Dragons, the commoner supported a tone of a functioning world of villages, trades, and basically the mundane. Often referred to as the normal human, other races are available. They were a default non-player character that did not progress with experience points. They had 1 hit dice, no special abilities, and a poor armor class. Because of this, monsters were terrifying to the general populace, which was filled with commoners. A goblin was dangerous not because it was optimized, but because it could kill a farmer, and delight in doing so. A dragon was a hugely disruptive force, because it could quite easily destroy a town, and therefore livelihoods. The scale of threat was calibrated against the common people. Why? Well, so that they would seek bold and eccentric adventurers, stupid enough to face these challenges whilst they went back to tending their fields in blissful ignorance. This framing made adventurers exceptional. A first-level fighter was a cut above the average soldier. This is why in early editions they came with the title of veteran. A 5th-level cleric might even be a regionally recognized figure. A 9th-level wizard was a force to be reckoned with, that even the ruling class found fearful. The world had credibility because, despite all the power of adventurers and the monsters that inhabited the world, the majority of the world's populace were just commoners, going about their business with very little in the way of magic to help. The scarcity of adventurers lent weight to their exceptionalism. They were not common. The average low-skilled labourer was.
Okay, so this is something that I've touched on many times before in world building videos and in other things. It's the concept of, like, I tell people all the time, like, if we think about it from an athletics standpoint, your level 1 character is like a gold medal Olympian or a high level NCAA Division 1 player or a practice squad player on a professional team, like minor leagues. By the time you're 3rd and 4th level, these are career professional athletes. By the time you're 5th level, you're talking, you know, first ballot Hall of Famers, greatest of all time conversation. By the time you start getting into your 8th, 9th, 10th level, you're talking your generational and multi-generational talents, your Barry Sanders and your Bo Jackson and your Michael Jordans and your Larry Birds, you know, the kind of people whose their talent is not just once in a generation, but sometimes once in many generations, some, you know, far beyond anybody else. And that's what your players are. So you really destroy this when you start bringing in the high level NPC that's part of it. It's like, well, you're getting sent out to take care of this problem, but the captain of the guard in this small town is a 5th level fighter, and y'all are a 3rd level party or a 2nd level party. Well, if the town has a 5th level fighter, why are they struggling with goblin raids anyway? A 5th level fighter will massacre the entire tribe by himself. So what's he doing there? And the other thing too, and this is where a trend started. Now, the disagreement that I have with BECMI Berserker we'll get to in a minute, is I'm going to save that for when we get to it, is where I think the starting point came from. But needless to say, it's not about special abilities. And it is in a way, but it's not. Let's think about special abilities for a second, specifically in Dungeons and Dragons. Elves, dwarves, non-human races have generally always had some kind of special things about them that set them above and apart from humans in a lot of ways. Even when there's other, say, minuses to try and, quote, balance them out, as a general rule of thumb, what we'll refer to as the monster races, and that means anything that's not human, are the ones that had exceptional things that set them apart, and humans were basic. When we started moving into these hyper high fantasy worlds, where instead of like when Gygax rolled out Greyhawk, and it was a world, basically it was like the real world, populated with hundreds and thousands of human nations, and then small pockets making up less than probably less than 15% of the global population, is these monster races. Maybe 20% of the population total or so are these, quote, monster races. And the absolute majority, 85% of the entire population of the world is human. We've moved into these things where it's like, oh, well, there's like the 7 elven nations, and then there's the 15 dwarven nations, and there's the halfling tribes, and there's the great gnome barbarian hordes that are everywhere. And then there's the orcs that are number in their tens of millions and whatnot. And humans, even if humans are barely a plurality in these worlds anymore. And they're very rarely an absolute majority. They may be stated to be an absolute majority, but the way the societies are set up does not operate as if humans are an absolute majority. So these magical powers and abilities, these above average, basically imagine the world if everybody's a gold medalist. Okay. Except for maybe 30 or 40% of the population that is, bronze medalist or so, or not even qualified for the Olympics. You don't have that majority. Most people don't even make the Olympic team. We've turned these fantasy worlds into where just about 90% of the world is Olympic caliber, and gold medalists walk all over the place.
This way, the presence and relevance of commoners gave the world stakes. When a village was threatened, it mattered. When a kingdom fell, it wasn't just a map change, it was a loss of all the relationships had with its people. The commoner was the narrative gravity that kept the game world grounded. Without a close relationship with the common people, a campaign drifted and lost purpose by being separated from the world it inhabited. Sure, an adventure might take characters into extraplanar lands, but the core reason usually stood on the shoulders of the relationship with the campaign world up to then. When 3rd edition came along in the year 2000, the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons was changed entirely. It was the D20 system, and it shifted D&D from a game of rulings to a game of rules. The commoner became a formal NPC class, with the potential to even be 20th level, 1d4 hit dice, and proficient in a single, simple weapon. In my opinion, it was a bit of a mechanical joke. A kind of perverse use of the build system to demonstrate the abilities of one commoner over another. Where previously a dungeon master would just let the players know whether an interaction with some commoners yielded what they wanted, the game's design philosophy moved towards optimization, and the commoner became the anti-build, a way of codifying mundane tasks and potentially restricting the availability of help to adventurers because a group of commoners didn't have a particular kind of skill. And I think most dungeon masters listening would have moved those goalposts anyway, whatever the build said, just to keep the game going. In other words, the point of this system for commoners was basically meaningless.
So here's where we start getting into some big disagreements. This is more of that granularity I was talking about. That's not what that system does. I mean, you'll notice that you're a 8th or 10th level commoner, and it puts you on par with like an orc or a bugbear. A bugbear is more dangerous statistically than like a 10th level commoner. But what this does give you is the ability that if you really want to granularize, if you really, really want to add the kind of versatility and variety of people that exist in, say, in a more cosmopolitan area or in a town, you can do it. It also gives you a baseline for you to think of. Well, here's this guy who was the blacksmith for 20 years, and yeah, he's just a commoner. He never had any special training. He definitely doesn't have any special abilities, feats, that sort of thing. However, he did, from swinging that hammer for so long and making these weapons and having to make sure that the weapons were balanced properly, having to make sure that they function properly, even having to make sure that certain farming implements and tools, axes, hoes, scythes, that sort of thing, were balanced properly and worked the way they needed to. Understanding those differences makes him a far deadlier opponent than, say, just your average commoner, your average farmer, and that sort of thing. My dad used to tell me that roughly equivalent to what he would call a dojo black belt, or a guy who has gone and learned the techniques and stuff, and gone to the karate studio and the basics of how to fight and how to defend themselves, is roughly equivalent to like your roughneck on the oil rig, mainly because your roughneck on the oil rig just lives a life that beats the hell out of him harder than most people are ever going to recognize. You're going to have a concrete, when the joke in the trades is the concrete worker. Nobody wants to mess with a concrete worker because the dudes spend all day, every day getting beat to hell in the hot sun, shoveling around 60 and 80-pound bags of concrete. They're tough as nails. So just from the dent of their life, that gives you a method to put that kind of thing in there. Just because something has the ability to be codified does not inherently twist it into this, oh, well, we've started to make them an anti-build, and we've started to quantify them in the world and make them something that's doesn't need to be there. I'm going to tell you where your problem came from. 2 words: Forgotten Realms. Came out in the 80s, got big in the 90s, became the default for D&D, really became the default for D&D. I believe it was the default in 2nd edition. It was definitely the default by the time we got to 4th and 5th. Greyhawk was technically the default in 3rd edition, but you did have a bunch of campaign settings that came out as well, just like you did in 2nd. Here's the issue with Forgotten Realms. Greyhawk, 90% of all other fantasy worlds and stuff. Humans, by far the dominant species numbers wise. You might have like, oh, the orcs and goblins multiply greatly, but they tend to be weaker and more cowardly, et cetera, et cetera. But like even in Tolkien, where Tolkien would talk about how the orcs multiplied in their vast numbers underground, they were still outnumbered by men, for the most part anyway. It was compared to the elves that they did this. And when they talked about their vast multiplication. And they were also smaller and weaker than both elves and men. They were much. A lot of people think of the orc as the big towering thing. It's not what an orc was in Tolkien. They were smaller, they were weaker, they were scrawny. So, the half orcs, the big Uruk-hai fighting warriors, were as big as a man. So, what you've done with Forgotten Realms is you went from a world that's like 90% human, and that elves, dwarves, halflings, et cetera, are a curiosity and oddity. And Forgotten Realms, you have entire elven nations, and then entire moon elf nations, and then entire sun elf nations. And you have moved the fantasy races away from being fantastical beings as to being stand-ins for different nations and different races as we view them in modern society. Your tieflings and your half-orcs and your half-dragons and your elves and your halflings and your dwarves of 14 different shapes. they're all over the place. And you've got cities like Waterdeep that are ridiculously cosmopolitan and make absolutely no sense when you exchange. The only way they make sense is when you exchange something like half dragon for just like another type of human, because a half dragon in a more fantasy setting is going to have these draconic needs, these draconic drives. They are probably going to have different dietary and hunger type things. They're not going to behave like humans, so therefore they're not really going to fit in a human city very well. Whereas you look at Forgotten Realms and the way it is populated itself over into how we build Dungeons and Dragons worlds and campaign settings, what you end up with is, the dragon kind over there, the half dragon, is drinking the same ale as the dwarf, that's drinking the same ale as the human, the same ale as the elf, the same ale as the halfling, and the same ale as the orc. You haven't created a different race in a fantasy setting where it's like a different people with a different genetic code, much more like a different variant of the same species. You've done it the same way as like it's a black person, a white person, an Asian person, a Mexican person. Sure, there's some differences, but you can't even tell the difference in the skeletons for the most part. And the blood types are the same blood types, and they have the same oxygen and food requirements as a general thing. They've minimized those variations and therefore minimized the fantasy elements of it. We go back to what BECMI was saying here a minute ago. They have these special abilities and special powers that they're characterized by. And that's fine when they're definitely a minority. When you bring them into this case, now you're introducing their special abilities as being not special because you have made them not special by overpopulating the world with them and making the societies overly cosmopolitan.
Unless you wanted to rigidly stick to what NPCs you have built and let the game stall. As a result of this kind of game design, campaign worlds began to reflect this shift. Monsters gained templates, feats, and scaling abilities, and what were mundane NPCs, such as farmers and blacksmiths, were statted in the same way as adventurers. Thankfully, this kind of build for commoners was not quite the same by the time we reached 4th edition, although that did include the concept of minions and rabble and lackeys, and I believe there was no universal non-combatant commoner stat block, but please let me know if I got that wrong. 5th edition did thankfully move away from this build approach and include a basic commoner stat block in its monster manual, reminiscent of early editions.
So I want to point this out here. He has the premise that this came from the statting the commoner the way you stat an adventurer because of the standardization in D20 system. But I think we can all agree that this problem is far, far worse in 5th edition than it ever was in 3.5. And yet he's sitting here saying, "Oh, look, they've gone back to it in the monster manual here." And it's still statted out just like a player. It's just it doesn't tell you how the sausage is made.
A kind of return to the normal everyday person that made up most of the world, and that was a good thing. However, the system has also doubled down on the trend for powerful builds and high fantasy. What this has meant for characters and their adversaries is that they are incredibly powerful, even at low levels. So the idea of a village full of mundane commoners in a world of prolific spellcasters, energy-resistant characters, and half-dragon, half-demon bards with a touch of moonshade starts to look strange. This has resulted in almost every character being special. Backgrounds, once a sharing of storytelling load between the DM and the player, has become factory-style templates granting mechanical benefits. So one has to ask, how are the common people expected to survive and operate in a world like this? When the majority of creatures are akin to superheroes and supervillains, what is the place of the commoner in society? When it comes to playable races, they now come with innate powers, and classes are front-loaded with features that don't have to be earned. Take the folk hero background, for instance. Even the name makes it obvious that there's someone special, even before the story has begun. The immediate premise is that of a chosen one. I think Harry Potter would be a good example of being a folk hero at the beginning of a story. And as with all background templates, the game assumes that the player character is exceptional, well before they get the dumb idea to sally forth into some cave that anyone else with good sense stays away from.
Okay, so this is one of the pieces where I have a large amount of agreement with him, though I think he kind of misses the point a little bit. This is one of the worst things that 5th edition can bring about. Now, I've been asked before about the toxic player agency that I bring up on a regular basis. It's kind of a field of study, I guess you could say. It's a bit of a philosophy that I started a while back that started coming to me a few years ago as I was reading through. Actually, when I started my channel off of something that I began to recognize as what I call toxic player agency. And it's kind of evolved from there. But the general idea is toxic player agency is any time that player agency is taken into a place that poisons the game, either by having a toxic social influence on the players, having a way that it poisons the interactions at the table, or undermines game master authority, or undermines the natural order of how the game needs to run, or if it has some kind of pollution in game that causes a problem. And this is an example of the latter. There is nothing wrong with a player having a high degree of agency over something like a backstory, trying to talk about where their character came from, as long as it works within the framework set by the GM for that narrative, or for that story, or for that world. But also as long as it makes sense. However, when you start to give a mechanical benefit based on backstory, this is where you start to have some serious issues, because now you are having a player who, by picking some kind of backstory template, which no matter how they try to write their backstory, we all know how players behave. They're going to seek out the mechanical advantage. And it's like, okay, well, for what I'm doing, what makes my character work the best, I need to have this backstory. So let me manipulate some stuff to try and make that happen. Now you have them, and their backstory choices are directly impacting the world, which is infringing on the game master's agency. And that is not just a forever GM whine of boo-hoo, you're infringing my agency, like a player might say, boo-hoo, you're infringing my agency. What that is when the game master does something that is globally effective on the world and changes the way things work, he's one character that controls that aspect, and the players still act freely within it. However, when a player does it, the player is now initiated kind of a tug of war with the game master. And when you mechanically allow and mechanically incentivize all of the players to do so, now you have 5 players who are trying to tug the narrative, or even worse, tug the world itself in 5 different directions. And when you have 5 people pulling the same thing in 5 different directions, we generally refer to that as drawing and quartering it. In other words, you are ripping your game apart by having that particular flavor of agency distributed to 5 characters, 5 character players, as opposed to the single GM. It would be no different than every other player getting to have a piece or a say in everything about your character. So, for instance, you're trying to put your character together, but I get to determine something like your race, and Billy over there gets to determine something like what feats you take, and John over there gets to start assigning your skill points. And in the end, you got this weird wizard with a bunch of points in athletic abilities and stuff, and a 4 intelligence, and can't cast any spells, and no weapon proficiency, but he can pick locks. And what you got is this hodgepodge of nothing that's no good at anything, because you had too many cooks in the kitchen. The same thing happens here. And so when you have things like that, it's like, it's great to have some backstory templates. 3.5 had plenty of places where it would say, oh, do you want to make this kind of character? Well, here's some suggestions for things you might want to take, feats you might want to take, changes you might want to take. The worst thing that ever happened in 3.5, and something that I disallow in every single game I run, is the flaws system, where you were able to start taking flaws in order to get additional feats and abilities. This is heinous and awful. And it leads to what I call red mage syndrome. It's a reference to an old newgrounds.com skit show called 8-Bit Theater, where the red mage is like, holy crap, how do you have these powerful stats? And he's like, well, I took a whole bunch of minor personal character flaws like bad breath and nose picking and exchanged it for like increased combat abilities. All right. That's the kind of crap that leads to. And the backgrounds that have impact on the game situation, even if they have, quote, negatives to balance them out, players are going to optimize. And not only that, because they have impact on how the world works, they're going to start to tear the world apart out at the seams as you have 5 and 6 different people pulling in different directions.
The idea of rising from obscurity has become undesirable. Achievement without effort has become the norm. All of this creates a world where everyone is someone. But if everyone is someone, then no one is no one, which means the commoner disappears, not just from being a stat block, but from the story. Since I mentioned Harry Potter, the world of those books is an excellent example of the peripheral use of the commoner, or muggle in that case. A fringe and, let's face it, comical element to a world that, let's face it again, doesn't need them. Let's ask a simple question. Who grows the food? In most modern published D&D settings, this question is rarely satisfactorily answered. Cities are vast, magical, and self-sustaining. Trade happens, but it's undefined, and food production is hand-waved. Goods appear, but the labour is invisible. The economy is a backdrop of service delivery, not a system dependent on the people of the realm. You only have to look at the difference between the 3rd and 5th edition Forgotten Realms campaign settings to understand how much this has been brushed over in recent years. This is not just a narrative oversight, it's a world-building failure. We're not just talking about trying to get the players excited about the delivery of some ale to an inn, although, I don't know, that can be pretty exciting. But anyway, having a picture of an economy and political backdrop that ensured the inn would get that delivery of ale, and that the innkeeper won't be going out of business this week, anchors the imagination to something that's familiar. Sure.
This is one of those situations where you have to understand that in a lot of cases, magic becomes a stand-in for technology. And because players and GMs, for that matter, in the modern era can't be bothered to put time into the hobby to learn how things work, they try to make it more quote-unquote realistic in the way that it more simulates the modern world as opposed to a true fantasy world. And you get this kind of crap. The problem is that the more powerful the magic, the more prevalent the magic, the more analogous to technology it comes. And we have technology that exists through magic that doesn't really have a real world, contemporary word I'm struggling for here, a direct reflection in the real world, things like teleport and that sort of thing, that we don't have that in the real world. And you start to move almost into a post-scarcity society. However, you start running back into that same problem I was talking about before with your powerful, characters and why do we need adventurers? Because think about it. If you're a blacksmith and your regular town blacksmith has the ability to craft these high-powered magic swords, why do you need adventurers? If you have a 5th level fighter for the police captain, why do you need the 2nd level party? This prevalence starts to erode the need for anything other than mid to high level characters, which leads to the power creep and the other problems, the broken games we have, leads to the situations where you have to optimize your character in order for them to be functional, or you have to break the realism of the world. And while you might have a bunch of people who say, oh, I don't care about that. Players don't care about that. It's fantasy. It's fantasy. The word, by the way, that is one of the most horrible things. Oh, it's fantasy. It still has to make sense. And then while we're on the same topic, oh, these are make-believe is not an excuse to do things poorly or to do things illogically or to screw up things that other people created by saying shit like, well, it's a fantasy race, it's make-believe, I can change it if I want to, with no respect to the original creator. It's like, well, then come up with your own word for it while you're at it. Because what you made is not an orc anymore. It's now whatever the hell you made because you changed it. Orc has a meaning. But I digress. If your blacksmith can make that flaming +2 sword, he doesn't need the party anymore, because yeah, they may all be much better fighters than him, but he has a +2 flaming sword, which makes him at least as good as a second level fighter, only he does more damage with his flaming sword. He can take care of the goblins themselves. The goblins aren't going to attack his village because he's got flaming swords R Us over there. Also, why is he making anything else if he has the ability to crank out these high-end, high-powered weapons? All right, so you have to have some things that balance that out, and you have to have those common people to make these things unavailable. You know, getting rid of the ye olde magic item shop shouldn't be a ye olde magic item shop unless you are using that to stand in for modern technology. I don't need a fighting man. I have a machine gun. I'm sorry, I don't have a machine gun. I have a magical bow that does more damage and allows me to attack more often. So I don't have to be a fighting man to defend the area.
Well, it's a fantasy world, but it must also be a functioning one. A functioning world requires logistics. Grain must be grown, milled, and transported. Iron must be mined, smelted, and forged. Roads must be built and maintained. These are not glamorous tasks, but they are essential. Without them, the world collapses, and yet in most D&D campaigns, these systems are hand-waved or replaced by magic. And if it is replaced by magic, then we have replaced the commoner, and so their place in the world is in jeopardy. The rise of magic as a substitute for labour is a key factor in the disappearance of the commoner from the stage. Spells like create food and water, fabricate, and teleport can bypass entire industries. A high-level wizard can replace a supply chain, a cleric can heal injuries that would sideline a farmer for weeks, and a druid can grow crops in barren soil. Okay, but that's always been the case with Dungeons & Dragons. These spells have been around since almost the very beginning. Well, yes, but critically, it comes down to scale. What used to be a functional backdrop that included remarkable individuals capable of great things has been subverted. In post-3rd edition D&D, we've seen worlds designed with an overwhelming imbalance of the exceptional replacing the functional. I mean, just take a look at this picture illustrating the patrons of the Yawning Portal in Waterdeep. How could a commoner feel safe here? I know that there are some bars you should stay away from, but my god, this is a freak show. And this kind of front and center presentation of exceptional characters in mundane settings shoves the commoner into the background, into the part of the stage with no lighting. The adventurer is no longer just a hero, they are the infrastructure. The impact on the common people, in terms of not only function but plot and background noise, is that they eventually become redundant and surplus to narrative requirements. Exit stage left. When the baseline of a campaign world is high fantasy, scale becomes meaningless. A dragon destroying a village is no longer a tragedy, it becomes a set piece. The village didn't matter, the people didn't matter. What matters is the image of heroes armed to the teeth in impractical armor, wielding oversized weapons, charging headlong into a marathon combat session. The reasons fall into the background and become secondary to the grind and high fives of victorious adventurers, whilst, if you were to permeate the smoke of battle and illustrate that background, you might just catch a glimpse or hear a cry of villagers weeping at the loss of their loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods. The consequence of this should have ripple effects in the campaign backdrop, because, as heroes, you are there to protect those weaker than you. They should be your reason to keep going, but if the commoner disappears, where does your motivation come from? Emotive scenes like I just described build great campaigns, and it comes from caring for the common people, potentially your own people. You might see a wrong that needs to be righted, those responsible brought to justice. This way, a campaign is built on ripple effects that grow outwards from every interaction with the world, and not just from a bunch of chosen ones that undermine the stakes of the game. If the world is populated only by adventurers and powerful monsters, then it just becomes a clash of stat blocks. Ensuring there is peace and stability becomes irrelevant, and the campaign world becomes a theme park. And there's no place for the mundane in a theme park.
This is also, and he's dead on in this case, and this is also where you end up with an impetus for your, like you said, your loot goblin and your murder hobo and some of your other bad, quote unquote bad player types. Yes, you're going to have some players that are going to behave that way regardless, that have to be corrected or excised from your game. But if you have not created a situation where they need to care about these people, they're not going to, which is going to lead to that kind of sociopathic and apathetic behavior. It's like this. If the villagers are helpless against this kind, and not just you said they're helpless, or NPC X told you they were helpless, if it is demonstrated that these characters, and they see in the world that they exist in, that these NPCs, these common characters in the world are in fact helpless and have to be defended and protected by the players grow attached to them. They have empathy for them. They become something that the players have to deal with on, and I'm going to use the word emotional, though that's not the entirely the best way, but on an empathetic level, there's an emotional attachment there. If you have a world where there's absolutely, I don't care how great a role player they are, I don't care how bought in they are, and I don't care how well they suspend their disbelief, in the back of their skull, if their logical mind tells your players there is no reason why I need to be doing this village, these people could do this for themselves. We are just doing this adventure because that happens to be the adventure. You are going to develop this kind of adversarial play and this kind of bad character behavior because they are detached from the world in that manner. They are detached from consequences because they see no consequences for the common people who are asking them to take the adventure.
There are examples out there in the 5th edition adventure range of attempts to offer a basic setting filled with interesting commoners from the start. Red Larch in Princes of the Apocalypse is a good example, with its descriptions of numerous commoner shop owners, etc. I have to admit, this was quite heartwarming when I first read this publication, as it harked back to Homlet in the original Temple of Elemental Evil game, which was the intent. However, by the time we get to the publication of Tomb of Annihilation and arrival at Port Nyanzuru, we find very little mention of commoners throughout its city locations, favouring instead templates and builds that are far more powerful. And we've seen this trend escalate through products such as Waterdeep Dragon Heist, released just a year later, which communicated a menagerie of all sorts of things that made me wonder where the normal everyday people were. In older editions of Dungeons & Dragons, the mundane commoner was ever present. The Known World campaign setting, released in a series of gazetteers in the late 80s and early 90s, dedicated each publication to a specific nation and did a wonderful job of framing and contextualizing the politics, economics, and societies of these countries, which all relied on the regular population, not extraordinary adventurers, to function. Indeed, a core offer within these publications was to support the Dominion rules in the BECMI edition of the game, released around that time. This was because in that edition of the game, the campaign world is central to a character's aspirations. It's baked into the rules, due to there being mechanics for each class to be able to run a domain, be it a thief's hideout, to a dungeon, or even a kingdom. The rules ensured that these were meaningful goals, because the campaign world had a population that was important because you had to interact with it. In time, it would be you who ruled over the commoners, you who taxed the farmers, and therefore you who protected their villages and livelihoods from invasion and threats from monsters. In modern D&D, these Dominion mechanics are absent from the core game, and so these aspirations are rare. The game focuses on personal power, not societal impact. The idea of building societies is secondary to the character build. The common man is not someone you lead, he is someone you forget. This is why, in my opinion, when completing a modern D&D campaign, there is always a sense of, is that it? Or what now? The objective has been completed, but there's no link to strategic vision, because the characters were never actually playing the long game. The kind of campaign that continually brings you back from heady adventuring to the task of administering your dominion and protecting your interests by protecting your people from those pesky barbarians over the border. Look, what I'm not saying is you must insert dominion play into your games to make them meaningful. What I am saying is that campaign worlds are richer for incorporating the importance of common people into the backdrop of the game. It is they who build culture through storytelling and song. They who are your eyes and ears on the road. They who sell you equipment, shoe your horse, or even just buy all the crap you've looted from the Necromancer's Tower, no questions asked. The commoner is central to world building because who else are the good guys trying to save, or the bad guys trying to dominate? When you follow that thread, you eventually reach the common man and woman. They are your anchor to realism in a fantasy world that could quite easily become utterly chaotic without them.
Absolutely right. They are the anchor. They are the ground floor. Be exceptional. You have to be able to compare yourself to something that is not exceptional. And by being not exceptional, that means it must be commonplace and prevalent. So whether you're exceptionally good or exceptionally bad, it's all about how far you deviate down the bell curve from one side or the other. There has to be that 90% of everybody for you to be in the top 1%. There has to be another 99%, right? And there has to be a distribution that's largely in the middle there for you to compare it to. Now, I will take umbrage with one thing you said here. It's like, oh, they buy your crap from the necromancer thing. This is another place where realism matters in your world. You, even if you're not doing anything narrative, you're doing very much the random roll, hex crawl, very much adventurer, dungeon delver style play. If you stop treating your towns like it's a Final Fantasy video game or something, where for some unrealistic reason you can sell them a whole bunch of high powered magic items and get gold for it, but the best thing that they happen to have to offer in that town is regular sword 1. And if you stop treating these places like, this is one place that 3.5 was great with. Some of the older materials had this stuff too. I believe there was some in the original DMG that would say, hey, in this type of town, this is the maximum wealth this town would have. This is the best thing you can buy here. This is the highest thing you can expect to be able to trade with here. And you can't drive a fleet of Ferraris into a backwoods town of 500 people and expect to sell one of them, let alone all 500 of them. The wealth does not exist. And even if it did, they'd have to sell off everything they own just to have the car that they don't need. They need the food, the water, et cetera, et cetera. So if you got your necromancer tower worth of stuff, sure, you might be able to unload flour, wheat, staple items, stuff like that back in town, but you're only going to be able to get rid of a couple of them magic things. It might be a whole nother quest all on itself just to find somebody to buy the crap you stole. And it should be.
While recent editions of Dungeons & Dragons have leaned into high-powered characters and magical spectacle, there remains enduring value in acknowledging the role of the commoner. Their presence gives the world texture, consequence, and a sense of scale, reminding us that not every story must begin with greatness to matter. Reintroducing the common man into our campaigns doesn't mean abandoning fantasy, it means anchoring it. Whether through domain-level play, grounded world building, or simply remembering who the heroes are fighting for, the commoner offers a quiet but essential counterweight to the extraordinary. And in doing so, they help the world feel lived in, not just imagined. Save the commoner, save the world. But what do you think? Agree, disagree, somewhere in the middle?
All right. So, yeah, that's about as good as it can be. How many times did he say things like realistic, grounded, real world, lived in? These are all important things, and they go away when we look at this kind of thing. And I do blame, like, kind of the Forgotten Realms run. When you get to that kind of not high fantasy, but high powered fantasy, it really messes things up. And the big issue that Dungeons and Dragons in particular has come up with is, if you're playing in that kind of setting, it works okay. But they started basing the game and its mechanics around that, as opposed to basing the game and the mechanics around the ability to adapt it to what you want. Even worse, especially with your modern gamer and your modern GM who want to phone it in, who don't want to put in any effort to be better at the craft of their hobby, who just want to be able to plug the video game in, hit power, save whenever they want to, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want to put in that level of work and creativity. What ends up happening is, well, I want to make a gritty, realistic Conan style world, but I'm going to more or less take the template of 5e. I'm going to grab the Forgotten Realms default, slap it on this, just make people a little saltier and a little more murdery and, a little less populated, and pretend like that somehow makes it work, when it makes even less sense with the prevalence of magic. None of this stuff would happen. We have lost the wisdom that came in Dragonlance. In the early Dragonlance books, they talk about how they tried to wipe out the magic users. They tried to wipe out the wizards and hold them up in their towers. And it was asked, like, how are they able to do this? How are you able to keep these super powerful wizards at bay? And it was said, well, you know, it doesn't matter how powerful a wizard is, they still have to sleep, they still have to memorize their spells, they still have to do all this other stuff in order to cast their magic. And if you've got enough people, they're eventually going to run out. They're going to get overwhelmed. That doesn't exist when everybody's a damn magic user, when magic's that highly prevalent. But these kind of counterweights, counter thoughts, and balances to make worlds that feel more lived in and make more sense, and therefore allow the players to become more immersed in them without those breaks from reality, those breaks in logic that snap them out of the game. Those are the things that we've kind of lost. And I think he's got a good point on this. So anyway, that's what I got for this one. This one's dragging on a little bit long. Going to be probably about 50, 55 minutes by the time I'm done putting everything together. And let's throw some ideas down in the comment section. What do we need to react to next? And what did I get right and wrong in this one? What did BECMI Berserker get right and wrong in this one? And what did you take from it that can make your game a little better? Let me know in the comment section below. Talk to you guys next time.